Ryan Thomas of the East West here, and welcome to the 7th episode of East West Academy. And in this one, we're talking about reverb. And this is one that viewers have been asking for a while now. So we've already covered the basics of writing, orchestration, and MIDI programming. So it kind of made sense to start in on some of the more production-oriented subjects. Now, we're not going to get too technical in this video, so no worries if you're a little bit new to all of this. But basically, we're going to end up with the reverb setup that I use in all of my demos, and we'll be talking about the practical reasons for the choices that went into it. So let's go ahead and get started. So the reason we're starting with routing is that I think it's essential to understand signal flow in order to use reverb correctly. And all signal flow refers to is the way that audio is being routed in your digital audio workstation. So think of your stereo out like a really big river that contains all of the audio content from your individual tracks, your buses, and your sends. And I'll explain what all of those are in just a minute. So right now we have 16 tracks that are all going directly to the stereo out. And you can see in the output where it just says stereo out. So let's go ahead and create what are called buses. And what the buses are going to do is basically create these submixes where all of the audio from the selected tracks are going to flow through that one single bus. So let's group all of our string longs together. And I'm going to include the key switch patches in that. So I'm just going to create a bus, and we're going to name this string longs. Okay, so now let's go ahead and group all of our string shorts together. So we're going to assign these to bus 2, and we're going to call this string shorts. Okay, so now all of the tracks in this session are being routed through 2 buses, the string longs and the string shorts. So anything that I do to the string longs bus is going to affect all of the tracks that are assigned to it. So for example, if I insert an EQ onto the string shorts bus, let's go ahead and use my strings preset. This is now going to affect all of the tracks that are assigned to it. And then here it is without the EQ. So you can obviously hear that the EQ is having an effect there. Again, that's because the audio from that viola track is being routed through the bus that has the EQ applied to it. So I generally like to do most of my processing at the bus level for a number of reasons, and we'll get into those reasons in future videos in the East West Academy series. But for now, let's go on to the next step, which is going to be creating a send. And unfortunately, Logic calls these buses, but depending on how you're using it, it's actually a send or auxiliary track. So we're going to say send this to bus 3, and Logic is going to create that auxiliary track, and we're going to call this string short reverb. And now with this control, I can basically tell Logic how much of the signal from the string shorts bus to send to the new track. So going back to the river analogy, if all of the string shorts are flowing through the strings bus, when I created that send on the strings bus track, basically what Logic is doing is duplicating the audio signal and sending that to now the string shorts reverb auxiliary track. It's not routing any of the audio from that bus to the reverb track. It's actually duplicating part of that signal according to the volume that you set right here, and then it's sending that to that auxiliary track. So it's a little bit confusing, but I think it'll make sense if you just kind of start doing it and playing around with it. So at 0, that means that this audio signal is going to be duplicated 100% and then sent to the string shorts reverb track. Generally speaking, when it comes to reverb, I'm sending, depending on the kind of reverb, between -15 to maybe even -3 dB. So it can really vary a lot depending on the reverb. But for now, let's go ahead and send 100% to this auxiliary track so that we can now start to talk about signal flow and how these effect plugins are affecting our audio signals. So what I'm going to do now is solo the string short reverb track which again, it doesn't have any reverb on it quite yet. And just understand that the signal from the patch I'm about to demo is coming from the track. It's being routed through the String Shorts bus, which is then duplicating that signal 100% and sending it to the String Reverb auxiliary track. So the signal is hitting that EQ before it's being duplicated and sent to that auxiliary track. So now what happens if I remove the send from the String Shorts bus and send to the reverb auxiliary track directly from the Pizzicato Strings track? We are now sending the signal from the Pizzicato Strings track unaffected by the EQ that's on the bus. So now what you're going to hear is the completely unprocessed Pizzicato Strings. So this is one of the reasons why routing is so important. It's not just a workflow thing, it can actually change the sound of your entire mix. Now, as this relates to reverb, the general idea here is that you want to be sending processed signals to your reverb auxiliary tracks. There are a few exceptions to that, which we'll get to later on in the video, but that's kind of the big idea in this section. So let's go ahead and start exploring reverb. So I went ahead and added that EQ to the String Longs bus, and I've also now made 2 reverb auxiliary tracks, one for the string sustains and then one for the string shorts. So let's go ahead and apply some reverb to the String Shorts bus. So we're going to send to the String Shorts reverb, and let's set this at, well, let's set this at 0 at first. And now we're going to load up East-West Spaces 2. Now, this is an incredibly special reverb. There's nothing quite like it on the market. So much work, so much effort was put into sampling these iconic orchestral halls, these iconic studio spaces. You've got plate reverbs, spring reverbs, and even digital algorithmic reverbs. So it's just a really beautiful plugin. It's been my go-to reverb plugin ever since it came out. The impulse responses are so incredibly clear, transparent, and just musical. So let's go ahead and check out the Reynolds Hall, and we're going to set the pre-delay to, let's say, around 25 milliseconds. I generally like to keep pre-delay between 10 and 40 milliseconds for orchestral music. And then I usually also just set the wet to -6 dB. That's just a workflow thing for me. You don't have to do that. That's just the way that I like to do it. And let's go ahead and just hear what this sounds like real quick. All right, so that might be a little bit too wet. So what we can do is just turn down the level of the send. So now instead of sending 100% of that duplicated signal to the String Reverb auxiliary track, now we're sending -3 dB of the original signal. So that's feeling pretty good to me. You don't need a lot of reverb for pizzicato strings or string shorts in general. And this is a fairly medium reverb just in terms of how long the tail is. So let's take a look at another space. And I really love the Northwest Orchestral Hall. We're gonna go with the rear room. And this one is gonna be really ideal for, I think, string shorts or maybe percussion, because it is a pretty epic sounding hall, but at the same time, the actual tail itself is on the shorter side. So let's go ahead and give this a listen real quick. All right, that's a little bit too much, so let's back down the send amount. Let's try -6 dB. And actually, let's bump it up just a little bit more. We'll go with -4 dB. So that is just such a beautiful space, and I really do like this one on pizzicato strings. So let's check out one more orchestral hall. This is another one of my go-tos, and I really love these instrument section specific impulse responses. So each one of these was actually sampled from the place in the stage where those sections would typically sit in an orchestra. This is not a software emulation or a simulation. These were actually, again, sampled from those physical locations. So they really just work beautifully together. And I typically will use the Southern California Hall for most of my orchestral instrument sections, and I'll use the instrument-specific impulse responses, and you just get these subtle variations that really give you an amazing sense of depth in the mix. So let's go ahead and load up the Southern California Hall strings, and we're going to do the rear room. And let's set the pre-delay right around 20 milliseconds. So let's hear what this sounds like at the current send level. That sounds pretty good. Let's actually just bump it up by maybe half a dB. Again, it's just a gorgeous hall, and having all of those different instrument-specific impulse responses does allow you to put these all in the same room, but there's enough variation in the reverb to, again, just give you that really incredible sort of 3D stereo image that you get when you use all of these IRs together. So what I want to go ahead and do is make one more send, and we're going to call this the Algo Glue. Now, East-West Spaces 2 is a convolution reverb, and without getting too much into the technical weeds, the idea behind a convolution reverb in general is to faithfully recreate or reproduce the sound of a room or a space so that you can place a sound source in that room or space and have it sound very authentic. However, Spaces 2 also includes impulse responses from spring reverbs, which you often find used on guitars, plate reverbs, which are often used for snare and vocals, as well as algorithmic reverbs, which you can think of as kind of being programmed from the ground up, just as a very complex series of delays. Now, a common practice in orchestral mixing is to send all of your sections to a convolution reverb, again, to place those sections in that space, but also to send to an algorithmic verb, which is going to help glue everything together, and it also tends to give you slightly more interesting reverb tails. So I'm going to go ahead and insert another instance of Spaces 2 in the Algo Glue auxiliary track, and we're going to go over to Digital. We're going to select Digital Hollywood Hall, and let's try out the 5.2 second tail, and we'll set the pre-delay to 20 milliseconds. So I'm also going to mute the other reverb so that you can hear this one by itself. That's obviously a little bit too wet, so let's go ahead and back off on the send amount. Let's take it down to minus 4 dB. That actually feels pretty good. Let's back it down just a little bit more. Let's go negative 7 dB. So that's feeling pretty good by itself, but now let's go ahead and mix it back in with the other reverb and try to get a good balance between the two. So let's unmute the first reverb, and let's just hear what it sounds like right now. Okay, I think there's a little bit too much of both reverbs, so I'm going to back down on the orchestral hall. We're going to go minus, let's say minus 4.5 dB, and we're going to back down on the digital reverb. Let's go ahead and back this down to minus 10 dB, and let's see what this sounds like. So I think that's sounding pretty much right on for a kind of middle-of-the-road orchestral strings reverb. Now from here, I would go ahead and start EQing the reverb, and you generally want to place the EQ before the reverb. You want to be EQing the incoming signal to the reverb. So let's go ahead and throw an EQ on both of these tracks. Now, many of you might be familiar with what's called the Abbey Road method of EQing reverb. And that's where you have the low cut all the way up to 600 hertz and then a high cut down to 10,000 hertz. And that might be great for certain styles of music, but I don't personally find it to be ideal for orchestral music. Now, I do still like having a low cut and a high cut, but I'm going to back the low cut down to maybe, let's say 160 or somewhere thereabouts. And then I do still like having the high cut at around 10K. So let's solo just the reverb by itself. This is going to make the sound very washy. There's not going to be any dry signal mixed in, but I want you to be able to hear the effect of the EQ very clearly. And I'm also going to turn the send amount back up to 0 dB, so the volume won't be too low. Here it is without the EQ. So that EQ is definitely helping to clean it up a little bit. Now, I do still like to fine-tune things, so I'll do some shallow cuts around the lows or the low mids, and then maybe just a slight dip around 1 to 2K. And that can be a problematic frequency range in some reverbs. That kind of gives you this sewer pipe effect. That's not always the case, but I kind of just do it now as a matter of procedure. So let's go ahead and hear it. Here it is without the EQ. So that EQ is definitely helping to clean up the sound, and that's really going to have a cumulative effect in a mix. So now what I want to go ahead and do is copy and paste this EQ over to the orchestral hall reverb that we're using, and let's solo that one. And I'm also going to increase the send amount to 0 dB, again, so that the volume isn't too low. And then here's this one without the EQ. So I think the effect on this one is a little bit more subtle, but in the context of a full mix, it's really going to help to clean up the sound. And let's hear the effect of both reverbs and these EQs now with the pizzicato strings. So that is feeling pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and explore one more quick thing before we leave this section. And I just wanted to show you very quickly how I like to apply reverb to the string sustains. So I'm just going to pretty much copy and paste everything from the short strings orchestral hall reverb. And I'm just going to get a little bit more aggressive with the EQ, say around 3 to 4K. And it's not even that aggressive. Now, I do also tend to send more to the reverbs from the string sustains. So here I might send maybe minus 3.5 dB, which is 1 dB more than the string shorts. And then I might send, let's say, minus 9 dB to the Algo Glue reverb. So let's go ahead and hear the legato violas, which sound absolutely beautiful. These are from Hollywood Strings 2. So now that we've gone through the rationale behind the process of applying reverb and processing it, let's go ahead and see how all of this fits together in the context of a full mix. All right, so let's start by talking about the string sustain reverb. And we're going to go ahead and just listen to the strings with the reverb for a few seconds so you can get an idea of what they sound like together. So I think this is a pretty middle of the road reverb setup. It's not super wet, it's not super dry. Let's go ahead and solo the reverbs so that you can hear what each one is doing. And we're gonna go ahead and solo the Southern California Hall strings reverb that I'm using, again, just for those string sustains. And I'm also gonna toggle the EQ on and off so that you can hear how much it's tightening up that sound. And that might not seem significant in isolation, but in the context of the full mix, again, that EQ is really gonna help to just clear things up and give you a much more even and clean mix. So now let's hear the digital verb by itself, and we'll go back to measure 8 here. So you can hear the tail on this one is a little bit longer, and it decays in this really beautiful and musical way. So now let's hear the two reverbs together. So you just get this really beautiful sense of depth with both of them together. Now for the string shorts, I'm actually using the Northwest Hall rather than the Southern California Hall, just because the tail is a little bit shorter, and generally speaking, you don't need a super long tail with string shorts. And even in the send amount to the Digital Hollywood Hall, you can see it's quite a bit less at minus 13.4 than the string sustains, which is right around minus 10. So let's hear the string shorts. So you can hear, again, the reverb tail isn't super long, but you still get a nice sense of space. And again, in the context of a mix like this one, you just don't need a lot of reverb on those string shorts. So let's go ahead and move on to the brass. And again, this Digital Hollywood Hall is used on pretty much all of my instrument buses. You can see the send amounts will differ depending on the instrument group, but again, I'm just using it to give us that really interesting musical reverb tail and also just kind of glue everything together. So really, the only thing that's changing across the instrument groups are these room-specific reverbs. So here I'm using the Southern California Hall Brass Specific Impulse Response. And let's go ahead and hear the brass at 14. So you can hear there's a fairly pronounced tail there. Let's go ahead and solo just the Southern California Hall brass reverb. And I'm going to go ahead and A and B it with and without the EQ. So you can hear again that EQ is really tightening up the sound. In the context of the mix, that's going to be really significant. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out before we move on is that I am sending a little bit of the flugelhorn signal directly from the flugelhorn track to the brass reverb. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because oftentimes the human ear can perceive those higher voiced instruments like violins, like trumpets, flutes, as being a little bit closer. They can often have a little bit more presence. So if you send just a little bit from the track to the reverb, in addition to what's being sent from the section bus, it can help to push those instruments back a little bit further in the mix. So that's what I'm doing here. So even though I'm sending the unprocessed signal to the brass reverb, it's okay because we're only sending a little bit. Most of the reverb is still being sent from that processed bus. So that's a fun little trick that you can use to kind of help push any instruments that are peaking out in the mix back just a little bit. Now, just going on down the line, for my epic percussion, I'm using the Northwest Hall, as well as, of course, the Digital Hollywood Hall. But specifically on the Three Large Taikos track from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion, I'm actually sending even more to the Digital Hollywood Hall and just a little bit to the Abandoned Abbey, which is a really cool reverb. I wouldn't typically use this for cinematic percussion, but in the context of this piece, it did just happen to work. So as always, definitely trust your ears. So here's the percussion. And then let's go ahead and solo all of the reverbs just so that you can hear what they sound like by themselves. And you'll notice again that those EQs have cut out pretty much all of that low content because you just don't need it in the reverb. Now for my wins, again, pretty much everything is the same. We're sending to the Digital Hollywood Hall. And the only thing that's really changed is that I'm using the Southern California Hall winds specific impulse response for these. Now I am using the same trick on the Uilleann pipes that I used for the flugelhorn. So you'll notice that I'm sending a little bit of extra signal to that Digital Hollywood Hall from the Uilleann pipes track. Again, it's going to be that unprocessed signal because it's not going through the bus. That's okay. Most of the signal that's going to these reverbs is still coming from the processed bus. So let's go ahead and hear the winds together. Now, if you'll notice, I had a dotted eighth stereo delay on the Uilleann pipes. That can be a really great way to help some of these solo instruments to sit in the mix. And in the context of a full mix, you just get this really sort of immersive feeling from that dotted eighth stereo delay. You don't necessarily hear it clearly in the mix. It's more of a feel kind of thing. Now, for vocals, I'm still using the Digital Hollywood Hall. It looks like I'm sending minus 7.5 to that one. But I'm also sending to one of my absolute favorite impulse responses in Spaces 2, which is the Hamburg Cathedral. This is just such an epic reverb for your cinematic choirs. Really perfect for this application. So let's go ahead and hear the vocals. And you can just hear the two reverb tails blending together, and it's just so incredibly lush. So now let's go ahead and solo just the Hamburg Cathedral reverb. And I'm going to go ahead and A and B it with and without the EQ so that you can hear the work that it's doing. So you can hear how that EQ is definitely cleaning up the low end. We're also getting that scoop in the sort of low to low mids around 300 to 400, and that's helping to clear up some of the congestion in that area as well. And of course, you've got that cut around 9100. And, you know, at the end of the day, you don't really need those air frequencies in the reverb most of the time because we're already getting that out of the dry signal. And you can see we're already boosting that in the EQ that's on the vocal bus. So you're getting plenty of that shimmery air frequency from this EQ. And again, you just don't need that reflected in the reverb. So that's pretty much it. Now, I do want to caution you against just copying all of these settings and thinking that that's going to work for you. It might or it might not. This might be a good place to start, but I would definitely encourage you to experiment, to go through all these different impulse responses, figure out what works for your style, for the way that you write. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got a lot from it. If you did, be sure to like it, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.